As the world celebrated its biggest milestone in generations, the government was furious with the Underground's management. The Jubilee extension was both late and over budget and provided the catalyst for the new Labour government to bring in some of the largest sweeping reforms the Underground would ever see. The government wanted to deliver its promise on improvements to public infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, without the need of borrowing money from the Treasury and increasing the burden on people's taxes. It was in effect a good plan, and they introduced new management to these structures that were more efficient in delivering the projects they were proposing. They got their necessary funding through a new scheme called the Public-Private Partnership. The partnership would allow investment from private backers, but it would still be in public hands. But the investors would now have a say in how the investment was spent and how the infrastructure was run. In 1997, the Underground, now the newly formed Transport for London, saw the new proposed arrangement a good way forward, and the motion was carried by the senior management. The money provided by the investors was stable and stops the age-old process of the Underground presenting an annual bid to the Treasury year on year for income, an income that rarely covered the £2 billion backlog of projects that needed to be completed. In 1998, John Prescott, Minister for the Environment, Transport and the Regions, backed the new public-private partnership and moved it to fruition. The publicly owned London Underground will be responsible for the running of the trains, fares, safety aspects and signalling, while private investors will be responsible for the stock and the maintenance of both the track and the tunnels. It was a 15-year contract worth over £7 billion, with no costings at all to the Underground. In 2001, after much vetting, two candidates were announced. Metronet Rail, a collaboration of no less than 5 different companies, and Tube Lines Limited. Metronet Rail looked after all the subsurface lines, Bakerloo Central and Victoria lines, while the Tube Lines Limited looked after the rest. The first 2 years of the new partnership could only be described as difficult. Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London at the time, put up several legal challenges against the partnership and had to be somewhat reassured that the venture was a good idea. But having to sort out over 125 years of red tape and paperwork was impossible. The taking over of part-completed projects was fraught with issues and financial complexities. In short, instead of making the promised profit, the private company's investments were spiralling out of control. Transport for London was still money hungry and upped the contract terms. £13 billion for 30 years, with the Underground putting in £1 billion yearly. Unable to keep its head above the water, Metronet entered receivership in 2007, and with no other backers willing to come forward, the Metronet public-private partnership collapsed in spectacular fashion, much to public ridicule and government embarrassment. For Tube Lines Limited, however, it wasn't as bad. They had managed to bring all of its projects in on time and under budget, so they continued until 2010, when Transport for London bought the shares back from them, bringing the Underground back under Transport for London's control once again. On the 6th of July 2005, the world watched with bated breath as the 2012 Olympic bid was announced by the Olympic Committee. As the UK's name was held up as the winner, the cheers could be heard in every corner of the land. Excited for the prospect, the euphoria of the announcement spilled into the next day. In fact, it was all people talked about. For the commuters, though, it was a typical Thursday morning. Among the dozens of passengers, Shahad Tanweer, Mahadid C. Khan, Jermaine Lindsay and Hasib Hussain had arrived at King's Cross, having setting off from the city of Leeds via Luton earlier that morning. Tanweer, Khan and Lindsay all boarded separate underground trains, while Hussein boarded the number 30 bus. The three trains set off within a few minutes of each other, with the trains mostly standing room only. At 8:50, the trains were approaching Aldgate Station, Russell Square and Edgware Road, when there was a loud bang and a flash of white. Passengers on each of the trains were thrown from the carriages, suffering catastrophic injuries from the shrapnel and the blast force as the trains were torn apart. The narrow tunnels funneled the blast down the train, causing more carnage. At 9:47, Hussein triggers his bomb, blowing the roof off the bus as he was travelling in. The transport system and its innocent passengers were savagely attacked, and both underground and overground, London shut down. The horror of the bomb blast could not be overestimated. There was a similar attack at Shepherd's Bush 2 years before, but it was quickly thwarted, and the terrorists were caught. And the UK had been on a higher state of alert since the 9/11 attacks. But the carnage was seen London had not seen since the war. Ordinary passengers became lifesavers as they tried to help their fellow passengers who only seconds earlier were unknown faces in the crowd. And passengers would console and offer comfort for those who would die in their arms, so they would not die alone and afraid. The emergency services became so overrun that they had to rush patients in whatever they could. Black cabs and taxis became ambulances to ferry the 700 injured in the explosions. Great Ormond Street Hospital, a centre designed for healing children, turned its own canteen into an accident and emergency centre for the wounded. The mobile networks collapsed under the sheer weight of calls and texts from both responders and loved ones. The 999 Trauma Centre was so overrun with 999 calls taking hours to connect, and thousands of people, dazed, confused, some covered in soot and dust, walked the streets, unsure what to do next. Both the underground staff and the responders got straight to work. Using the training and the lessons they had learned from the King's Cross disaster, they quickly assessed the situation and quickly created triage centres at each of the 3 underground bomb sites, while the rest of the underground staff evacuated the rest of the network. Tim O'Toole, the managing director at the time, oversaw the response, ensuring everyone's safety. For his efforts, Tim received a CBE, and a total of 19 merits and accolades were presented to staff, emergency services and local hospitals in the wake of the disaster. Tim wanted to prove that London would not bow down to terrorism and had the network running again less than 24 hours after the disaster. It was a move citizens roared for. London had been wounded, but it refused to lie down. 2 weeks later, the underground was struck again, but this time the bombers failed. The day after the bombers, John Charles de Menezes was shot and killed as he boarded a tube train when the police mistook him as one of the terrorists. While he was an innocent victim, his death was ruled as mistaken identity and a tragic accident. Later that year, the 4 men responsible were captured and each sentenced to 40 years in prison. Following the 7/7 bombings, the beat of London's heart grew stronger and stronger as it geared up for the Olympics. Transport for London focused efforts on the monumental task of moving upward of 2 million people daily on top of its normal morning commuters. To add to the task, the Games venues were scattered around the city, with the main focus on the stadium at Stratford. Ironically, the massive Stratford station, which was on the new Jubilee line, could easily accommodate the extra passengers, and little other than a few extra marshals were needed to point the people in the right direction. For the summer of 2012, the Underground performed amazingly, with both athletes and spectators praising the temporary magenta graphics outlining what event was at what station, and the way the Underground moved and helping people get to where they needed to be safely. The Underground was a proud torchbearer and was briefly shown in the London Olympic Games opening ceremony, and the photos of the 53 people who passed in the 7/7 bombings were displayed as a poignant and touching tribute. The improvements made to the underground for the Olympics would benefit the commuters for many years, and for a time the underground ran successfully. In 2013, to mark 150 years of underground running, a special train was allowed to run with a very special permission. Locomotive Metropolitan Class 1, numbered 353, had just come out of its 10-yearly overhaul and was allowed to grace the underground tracks for the anniversary. In a nod to the golden years of the Metropolitan, it holds a rake of historic Metropolitan wooden coaches. Many described it as going back to the glory days of steam, where the underground dragons would bellow and roar, unseen by sunlight. New innovations would grip the new decade. The underground started operating 24-hour services across the city. Contactless payments were introduced, negating the need to stand at ticketing stations. And of course, Oyster cards allowed the customer to pay and go as they pleased. The new Elizabeth line was introduced and well underway, and new driverless trains are being looked at. But what of the future? The future is bright, but uncertain. The recent pandemic hit the underground hard, but it's slowly on the road to recovery, and it is hoped that it will continue to expand and develop, providing the very best in service in the most unique way it knows how. Well, I really hope you enjoyed the series. In fact, I'm getting emotional, it's all done. Well, not quite done. I have one more episode. It's one I've been planning for a very, very long time, and it's something I'm very excited to do. So hang on until next time, folks. And all I can say is that it's gonna be a fun one.